You ever witness a moment when everything changes but no one raises their voice? Not a scandal, not a slip, just one sentence, so quiet, so precise, that it splits the air like a pin dropping in a cathedral. That's how it began. Not with a bang, but with a blink. This wasn't a dramatic confrontation. It wasn't live-streamed with hashtags or hashtags floating above a debate stage. It was just another polished discussion, a televised panel set up to talk about public education, soft lights, branded mugs, polite nods, senators in a semicircle, and for the first 10 minutes it stayed exactly that, predictable, rehearsed, untouched. Elizabeth Warren sat with confidence. She'd done this before, dozens of times. Her answers came with that familiar blend of policy rigor and emotional cadence. She hit all the marks: funding, equity, inclusion. Words like banners lifted in every campaign ad. It was calm, safe, professional, until it wasn't. Somewhere between the moderator's third follow-up and the pivot to state-level funding, something changed. Warren didn't fumble. She leaned in, and in doing so, she crossed a line no one had drawn yet. "Look," she began, voice steady, then tight. "I've spent my life fighting for inclusion. I understand heritage. I live it." No one had asked, but there it was, a word not yet spoken by anyone else. Heritage. Across the panel, Senator John Kennedy was silent. He wasn't watching her. He was flipping through a manila folder, slow and steady. When he finally looked up, the moment had already tilted. Everyone had heard it, and nobody could unhear it. Warren went on, about walking through institutions that made her feel invisible, about knowing what it meant to carry a story you didn't choose, and it was compelling, earnest even. But it wasn't the topic, and the room, though still quiet, felt different now. Kennedy waited. And then the moderator turned his way. "Just one question," she said. Kennedy nodded. "I'll be brief. No sharpness, no bait, just a Louisiana drawl so calm it felt disarming." He turned to Warren directly. "You mentioned your heritage, and I think honoring ancestry is something we all want to do. So I just want to ask, what tribe did you grow up with? Not what box did you check, not what you listed on a form." He asked about life, community, the kind you live in, not the kind you claim. The air changed. No one gasped, no one interrupted, but the temperature dropped. Warren blinked. "Well," she started, "I've always felt a deep connection to—" Kennedy didn't raise his voice. "I didn't ask about feeling. I asked about living." The moderator froze. The producers behind the glass didn't cut away. There was nowhere to go. No pivot. No rescue. Only silence. Warren looked back at Kennedy. His hands were still, his eyes steady, no smirk, no malice. Just one page resting on the edge of that manila folder untouched. He didn't move it. Warren continued, softer now. "My background is well documented." Kennedy nodded once. "Yes, ma'am, and that's what makes the omission so loud. It wasn't aggressive. It was surgical. The kind of cut you don't notice until you start bleeding." The moderator tried. "Let's shift back to funding statistics," she said. But the room had shifted, and the clip, already live, was spreading. The panel became a moment. The moment became a clip. The clip became a turning point. And Kennedy wasn't done. Slowly, he unfastened the red string on his folder. One sheet slid out. Just one. No speech, no report. A single page with 2 short paragraphs and a map. He didn't read it aloud. He didn't even quote it. He slid it toward Warren. "I think this belongs in context, Senator." She took it. The camera zoomed just enough. Viewers saw the title. 2018 Enrollment Metrics. Cherokee Nation versus Harvard Self-Reported Native Identifiers. One line showed tribal records, rooted in documentation. The other showed self-identification spikes on elite university hiring forms. It didn't shout, but it said everything. Kennedy didn't press, he simply added, "Just read it," the way our staff did. Warren scanned the footnote, internal memos, discrepancies, forms flagged, not accusations, questions that had gone quiet. Until now. The moderator looked sick. But the moment kept breathing. Kennedy turned, not to Warren this time, but to the camera. If the microphone's being held by someone who skipped the line, that's not inclusion. That's impersonation. No applause, no cue for outrage, just the kind of sentence that echoes after it lands. Warren folded the page. "I've answered these questions before." "Then one more answer shouldn't be hard," Kennedy replied. That line didn't trend yet. But the clip did. And Warren wasn't speaking anymore. Not about literacy, not about early childhood benchmarks. She was staring at the folder like it might open again. And it did. Kennedy pulled out a second document, a printout dated 1995, a university newsletter. Harvard Law School had called her its first woman of color with tenure. The sentence was circled. Warren leaned in. "That's not how I remember it." "It's not your memory," Kennedy said. "It's Harvard's quote." She tried to pivot. "We're living in a time where women, especially those shut out for generations, are constantly dissected." Kennedy didn't blink. He tapped the date. That label was doing a lot of work back then. It wasn't the volume. It was the precision. The kind of clarity that doesn't make a scene. It makes a statement. The moderator tried again. Curriculum, safety, test scores. But nothing landed, because one clip had already gone viral. One still frame. Just Warren, mid-blink, with that sentence printed below. If your story was only ever about pride, why did someone else's money have to tell it? Nobody remembered what came next. Not in the room, not online, not even in the transcript. Because in 12 words, a story unraveled. Not by force, by evidence. The panel moved on. But Warren didn't. And the conversation that followed wasn't about policy anymore. It was about power, about memory, about the fragile line between belief and branding. And somewhere in Louisiana, Kennedy packed up his folder and went fishing. He never posted a thing. He didn't have to. 3 days later, the email server at the university froze. Not crashed, not hacked, just overwhelmed. Dozens of FOIA-style requests had poured in. Journalists, academics, students, anonymous logins asking for old memos, archived newsletters, scanned admissions forms. The administration issued a boilerplate response. "We're evaluating what qualifies as public record, but the damage was already done." You can't outrun a timeline, especially when the internet is stitching it together in real time. A Reddit post surfaced showing side-by-side screenshots, one from Harvard's 1995 faculty review, the other from Warren's 2020 campaign site. The language didn't just conflict, it unraveled. One claimed identity, the other claimed distance. The comments weren't filled with insults, they were worse. They were methodical, curious, cold. A new generation of digital sleuths asking, what happens when personal history becomes institutional fact? Warren hadn't spoken again, not publicly. But she'd stayed in Washington, meeting with staff, cancelling panels, adjusting appearances. Those who saw her said she wasn't angry. She was quiet, intent. Like someone who'd stepped in something she thought was soft, only to realize it had weight, meaning, footprint. Meanwhile, Kennedy declined interviews, said everything he needed to on the panel. But quietly, the ripples spread. Advocacy groups paused endorsements. One education nonprofit removed her bio, not with an announcement, just gone, archived. And in classrooms, yes, classrooms, a few professors paused before citing her, not because they disagreed, but because they weren't sure how to explain what happened without reopening the whole discussion. It had become radioactive, not out of spite, out of discomfort, because the problem wasn't the claim. It was the scale of the consequence. What doors opened, what narratives hardened, and what it meant when nobody ever asked the second question until Kennedy did. And now, whether you liked him or not, whether you agreed or not, you couldn't unhear it. I didn't ask about feeling. I asked about living. Some lines become hashtags, some lines become footnotes. This one became a mirror. And across America, people didn't just ask who Warren was, they started asking who they were too. But the moment didn't die with the clip. It became a litmus test. Every new headline, every candidate's background, every editorial board review, it started to echo with the same subtext. Where does your story begin? And who else does it include? News outlets that had once published glowing profiles of Warren's journey began issuing quiet corrections. Not because they were sued, not because there was a retraction request, but because clarity had become currency. If you were going to talk about representation, now you had to define it. A podcast titled Lines We Cross devoted a 2-part series to the fallout. One episode featured Indigenous scholars walking through the criteria for tribal membership, cultural belonging, and legal recognition. The other was a montage, student voices, faculty reflections, and a compilation of conflicting claims from past speeches. The host didn't editorialize. She just let the quotes speak, and they did. In households across the country, the conversation shifted, not to anger, but to unease. People who had never doubted her sincerity were now asking what it means when institutions reward identity before confirming it. A high school debate team in Colorado built an entire case study around it. One girl argued for personal heritage as lived truth. Her opponent countered with institutional harm and gatekeeping. The judges didn't pick a winner, because this wasn't that kind of debate anymore. And Warren? She stayed quiet. She walked the halls of the Capitol like she always had, focused, fast-paced, folder in hand. But reporters noticed. She declined questions. Her office didn't circulate transcripts. Her comms team shifted tone. Less personal narrative, more legislation. One staffer leaked a line to a blog editor anonymously. "We're not rehashing this. We're writing bills." But legislation couldn't touch the weight of the moment that had passed. Because this wasn't just about Warren. It was about the system. A system that rewarded stories before checking their roots, that held open doors based on claims it didn't verify, until someone asked one too clever question, and the scaffolding trembled. The thing about moments like these is they don't end in headlines. They leak into classrooms, into donor meetings, into coffee shop conversations, into job interviews, into how we list ourselves in bios. The moment lives in the pause before someone selects a checkbox. Because now we all know someone might ask, and you better be ready to answer. That's the power of the question. Not just who are you, but who says you are. Late one night, a political strategist tweeted something she later deleted, but not before it was screenshotted, reposted, turned into a Medium think piece. It read, "Narrative is a tool, but if you sharpen it too much, it cuts back." The next day, Warren appeared at a roundtable discussion on women in leadership. She wore a navy blazer, no talking points on heritage, no anecdotes about her family tree, just numbers, legislation, and forward-looking goals. She stayed an hour, answered 6 questions, didn't linger. Outside, a reporter tried to get a final word. "Senator, would you revisit the conversation about identity in light of recent events?" She paused, tucked her papers into a bag, then answered with practiced calm, "I'm here to talk about policy. That's where my focus stays." And she walked away. But that wasn't the end. It was just the space after silence. The space where reputations breathe or shrink. Because truth, once questioned, doesn't get restored with a press release. It gets earned, line by line, choice by choice, word by word. And sometimes the story you stop telling says the most about who you are. By the end of the month, several organizations reworded their descriptions of Warren. Not maliciously, just cautiously. An asterisk here, a footnote there. Bio lines that once led with heritage now led with tenure, with teaching, with tax policy. The personal became private. And the private stopped being platform. Not because she asked, but because the question had already been asked, and nobody wanted to be the next one to answer it unprepared. This was more than fallout. It was evolution, of accountability, of identity, of public trust. And in that quiet shift, Kennedy's folder became something more than paper. It became precedent. The morning after Warren's quiet roundtable appearance, her name was no longer trending, but the conversation hadn't left. It had just gone subterranean. The clip no longer lived on front pages. It had moved deeper into the places where narratives ferment, inboxes, Slack threads, editorial meetings, alumni forums. A journalism professor at Columbia gave his students an assignment. Analyze how a single question altered public framing. No names, just the prompt. Most of them knew anyway. One student wrote, "It wasn't a confrontation, it was an audit, and the receipts weren't even loud. They were laminated." The phrase stuck. In DC, a think tank circulated an internal memo on narrative management. It cited the panel. It warned of a shifting tone among younger demographics who were less interested in emotional anecdotes and more attuned to the verifiability of claims. Anecdotal identity, the memo read, is no longer self-sustaining. It requires proof and context. That memo wasn't leaked by accident, and Warren's office read it. She was still moving forward. Speeches, votes, press calls. But the shape of her presence had changed. She was less visible on op-eds, fewer cable appearances. When she spoke, it was policy first. The tone of a candidate turning back into a legislator. And then came the request. A national education summit. She was asked to keynote. Topic: systemic inequality in access to higher ed. It was a natural fit. Her life's work, her legislative backbone. But now the subject itself felt like it hummed with danger, not because she didn't know it, but because part of the story that had always contextualized her passion had become radioactive. She accepted. but asked that it be closed press. The organisers agreed. Even still, a transcript leaked, not a recording, just text. No video, no inflection, just words on a page, passed from one inbox to another. And in that text, one line stood out. We all carry stories, but some stories carry others, across thresholds, into rooms, into networks that would have otherwise stayed locked. She didn't mention her background, she didn't name Kennedy, but everyone who read it understood the story had not been forgotten, just revised. And in that revision was both grace and caution. Back at Harvard, a graduate student submitted a paper titled Narrative Integrity in Elite Institutions. In it, she compared Warren's identity claims to broader trends of self-reported affiliation in high-stakes environments, corporate boards, faculty appointments, diversity reports. The thesis wasn't accusatory, it was investigative. The professor gave it an A-. And in the margin, just one note: you've raised the right question, now ask who benefits. That question spread too. Meanwhile, Kennedy had not spoken again on the matter, not on record, not on social media. His silence had become its own kind of presence. One journalist joked that he had weaponized absence, that the less he said, the louder the original moment echoed. But in Louisiana, at a town hall, a voter brought it up. Not angrily, just curiously. "Senator, you think that moment was fair?" Kennedy paused, took a breath. It wasn't about fair, it was about honest. And sometimes those ain't the same thing. He moved on, but the clip circulated anyway, because that's what the internet does. It recycles moments until they become myth or proof or both. Back in Washington, Warren's team began reshaping her digital footprint. Old bios were trimmed, personal anecdotes refocused. Her campaign archive homepage, once a mosaic of quotes and origin stories, now led with legislative victories, committee chair roles, student loan policy. Some of her supporters were disappointed, not because of guilt, but because of grief. They had identified with her story, found pieces of themselves in it. And now being told that those pieces might not have been what they seemed, it hurt. That was the quiet tragedy. When a public figure's identity becomes a symbol, and that symbol gets questioned, it doesn't just bruise the person, it fractures everyone who had held on. And yet others felt relieved. Not because they doubted her, but because clarity, even when it stings, is cleaner than confusion. A podcast called Hard Lines hosted a conversation between an Indigenous activist and a former Warren campaign volunteer. The host opened with this: "Let's talk about the moment clarity stopped being optional." The activist spoke first. "It's not about gatekeeping. It's about honoring what the gates are there for. They protect community, language, lineage, memory. You don't just walk through because someone told you a story when you were 6. The volunteer didn't argue. He nodded slowly. I believed her. I still think she means well, but it made me realize I never asked myself who that story belonged to. The silence after that was longer than the segment allowed. The producer didn't cut it, because sometimes stillness says more than rebuttal. And in that stillness, the country kept turning over the question: what do we do with identity that was claimed in good faith but never verified? Do we dismiss it, defend it, dissect it, or do we quietly just stop passing it around? No institution issued a ruling. No ethics board opened a formal case. But the shift happened anyway. One national education board issued new language guidelines for how applicants describe background. More emphasis on documentation. Less room for anecdotal descriptors. One Ivy League diversity office added a disclaimer to their site: self-reported identities are not a substitute for verified community affiliation. Nobody pointed fingers. They just turned the page. Warren, for her part, kept working. If the shift in narrative bothered her, she didn't show it. But in private meetings, aides say she was quieter, less animated when talking about her past, more focused when talking about the future, and in a strange way that sharpened her. Without the cushion of the story, she leaned harder on results. Bill passage, hearing prep, briefings. She wasn't trying to reclaim her narrative, she was rewriting it, not the past. The present, the kind you can't edit with sentiment, only with votes. And that, more than any clip, any quote, might be the real legacy of what happened on that panel. Because stories, when challenged, can shatter, or they can grow up. And in Warren's case, that process wasn't loud, wasn't angry, it was simply necessary, and she understood that now, even if no one ever asked again. It was a chilly morning in Boston when the ripple finally reached the archive. The university had received a request, not a lawsuit, not a headline, but a formal review petition from a group of alumni. They weren't angry, they were articulate, methodical. The letter opened with this: "We are not calling for erasure, we are calling for accuracy." The petition didn't demand removal, it requested annotation. They wanted footnotes added to several archived announcements, most notably the one from 1995, referencing Warren's appointment as the first woman of color to receive tenure at the law school. It wasn't combative, it was clinical. "Quote the newsletter as is," the petition said, "but add the full context. Let the records speak, but let them speak fully." The Archives Committee convened an emergency meeting, unusual for December. But what wasn't unusual anymore? Back in Washington, the Senate was in session, but Warren wasn't on the floor. She was in her office reviewing legislative amendments. Her chief of staff knocked once, entered gently, handed her a printed copy of the alumni letter. Warren didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, "They're not wrong." No one in the room responded, because it wasn't a confession, it was an acknowledgement, a line of truth cutting quietly through weeks of spin, and across campus, the quiet work began. One librarian was tasked with digitizing the affected documents. Another was instructed to begin collecting all uses of Warren's self-identification in official university materials. This wasn't a purge, it was a reshaping, and reshaping always takes longer. Meanwhile, a story ran in a small local paper out of Tulsa. The headline read, "For some tribal members, the debate was never theirs to begin with." The article wasn't flashy, it was personal. It followed a third-year law student from Cherokee Nation who said, "I didn't grow up hearing Elizabeth Warren's name. I grew up hearing my grandfather's. He taught our language, he protected our stories. This whole conversation, it never centered us." That quote struck a chord. It wasn't angry, it was distant. A reminder that some debates are framed from the outside, not the inside. The article got picked up by a larger outlet, then another. Then a think piece landed in The Atlantic titled, "The Cost of Borrowed Narratives." It asked not whether Warren was wrong, but whether our culture had failed to define the line between experience and inheritance. It posed a hard question. When does personal belief about identity become public policy burden? And in asking it, the piece didn't damn Warren. It pulled the camera back, looked at every resume that ever opened with origin, every diversity hire that hinged on unverified self-definition, every campus that wanted diversity statistics more than it wanted community accountability. Warren, meanwhile, kept her calendar. She wasn't hiding. But her speeches had changed. Fewer personal anecdotes, more data, more collaborative language. In one town hall, when asked about identity in hiring, she paused. Really paused. Then answered, "I think this is a moment for listening more than leading." That wasn't a pivot. It was a positioning. She was moving, carefully, from the center of the story to its periphery, not vanishing, just relinquishing some narrative gravity, and people noticed. A columnist who had once defended her with zeal wrote an op-ed titled, "Leadership also means knowing when to step back." In it, they acknowledged how much Warren had accomplished, but also how the story she had once told had grown too big, too complicated to live without qualification. The piece ended with a line that rippled across social feeds. She was never the villain, but she might have been the center when she needed to be the ally. That line landed harder than many critiques, because it didn't scold, it reframed. In New Mexico, an indigenous law professor created a workshop curriculum based on the panel fallout. It was titled Narrative Ethics in Public Spaces. The goal wasn't to shame, it was to teach. Day 1, understanding lived identity versus claimed identity. Day 2, power, access, and the implicit value of belief. Day 3, accountability without ejection. The workshop filled within 48 hours. Meanwhile, in the policy world, the reverberations became bureaucratic. A federal advisory board on grant applications revised its diversity criteria to require tribal enrollment documentation where applicable. Not in every field, but in the ones where representation translated into direct funding or hiring preference. It was the first institutional change directly tied to the questions raised on that panel. And still, Warren didn't push back. She didn't contest the new policies. She didn't go on defense. Her team quietly adjusted her eligibility statements on public applications. One sentence changed from, "She identifies as part Native American," to "She has shared family stories about Native ancestry." That tiny difference said everything. Across social media, the conversation had cooled. No new hashtags, no trending debates, but in comment sections you still saw the residue. Not fury. Reflection. Did she lie? No. But maybe she believed something she had no right to build on. She's done a lot of good. Yes, but does that undo the part where someone else didn't get seen because she did? Those weren't gotcha comments. They were unresolved reckonings. The kind that don't demand cancellations, but don't forget either. And then came the academic conference. It wasn't political, it was literary. A symposium on storytelling and public memory. Warren was invited to deliver a keynote, but she declined. Instead, she submitted a written statement. It wasn't long, but it said more than many of her speeches ever had. "I have learned that sincerity is not the same as certainty, and family stories, no matter how lovingly told, must be held with care when they intersect with lived experiences of historical exclusion. I did not set out to speak for others, but I see now how easily a platform can become a pedestal, and how even unintentional elevation can obscure others." The audience stood, not because it was a dramatic moment, but because honesty, real, bare, unvarnished honesty, is rare in political spaces. And in that moment, Warren did something many weren't expecting. She let the story sit down. Not walk away, not vanish, but sit. Become background, become context. No longer the headline, no longer the credential. And in doing that, she made space for the student in Tulsa, for the scholar in New Mexico, for the voter who still believed in her, but with clearer eyes. And maybe most of all for the question itself. Because that was what had always lingered, not the accusation, not even the clip. The question, who gets to tell what story, and what does it cost when they get it wrong? Not out of malice, but out of momentum. And who do we become, not when we defend that momentum, but when we slow it down and start again? That was what the panel had opened. Not a scandal, a reckoning. And reckoning doesn't end in applause. It ends in attention. And Warren, for all her words, had learned to listen. The final wave didn't come with headlines, it came with edits. Months after the panel, the story was no longer hot. It wasn't clickbait, it wasn't a trending tag. But it hadn't disappeared. It had dissolved into systems, into workflows, into how institutions define trust and transparency. A national journalism standards group added a new training module for editorial staff. Self-identification in source attribution. A simple guide on how to contextualize background claims made by public figures. Not to embarrass, not to verify in bad faith, just to make sure the record keeps up with reality. Meanwhile, a university in the Midwest launched a digital archive project on identity claims in academia. The focus wasn't on Warren. She was barely mentioned. Instead, it looked at 50 years of shifting language around race, culture, ethnicity, and how those shifts shaped the careers of people both seen and unseen. A graduate student on the project team said something that captured the moment perfectly. It's not about blame. It's about bandwidth. Who got to fill the page before others even had a pen? In Washington, Warren still served. Her approval numbers had dipped, then plateaued. Her colleagues spoke of her with the same respect they always had. But there was a difference. In hallways, in briefings, when people introduced her, they used her title, not her story. That was the unspoken change. She wasn't less respected. She was less mythologized. And strangely, that made her more grounded. Her advocacy became sharper, her proposals more measured. There was a quiet rigor to everything she touched now, as if every clause, every amendment had to stand on its own, unlifted by narrative. She seemed to prefer it that way. And then one day, she visited a small community college in Vermont. Not for press, not for a headline, just to listen. A closed session with first-generation students, many of whom came from backgrounds that didn't fit on clean application lines. At one point, a student asked, "How do you know when your story is yours to tell?" Warren didn't answer right away. She looked out the window. The room was silent. When she spoke, it was soft. "I think the question isn't whether it's yours, it's whether it costs someone else to tell it." No one wrote it down, but they remembered. And that answer, more than any retraction, more than any clarification, became the pivot. Because that's what had always been missing. Cost, not scandal, not intent, Just the unseen price of assumption. And in finally naming it, Warren turned the page, not just for herself, but for everyone watching. She wasn't trying to reclaim the spotlight, she was standing beside it, and letting it shine where it hadn't before. In the weeks that followed, a subtle cascade began. Podcasts revisited their old episodes and added updates. University bios added clarifying footnotes. HR teams in large non-profits revised how they ask about background during onboarding. None of it shouted, all of it mattered. At one editorial roundtable, a senior editor said, "We don't need to do exposés. We need to build systems that don't require them." That, in essence, became the legacy of the question. Not exposure, correction, not punishment, precision. And through it all, Kennedy never commented again. The man who asked the question never tried to shape what followed. He didn't need to, because the power of a good question is that it keeps asking itself. And this one did. Every time someone claimed representation, every time someone listed heritage, every time someone filled a form, the question lived in the margins now. And maybe that's where it belonged. In a final interview for a documentary about the evolution of identity politics, Warren sat on a small couch in her home, legs crossed, no notes in her lap. The interviewer asked, "If you could go back, what would you change?" Warren didn't flinch. "I would have asked more questions before giving so many answers." There it was. Not closure, but clarity. Not redemption, but responsibility. And with that, she smiled. Not the kind of smile that seeks approval, the kind that accepts weight. Because she knew now, better than ever, that some stories aren't meant to be carried alone. They're meant to be heard and handed back. The credits rolled on the interview, and the camera faded out, not with applause, just with stillness. The kind of stillness that follows truth, the kind that asks what we do next. Not for her, but for all the stories that are still waiting their turn. And maybe, just maybe, for the courage to ask, is this one of them?